Hi, my name is Natércia and I make content both here and on TikTok and Instagram about things that honestly set my soul on fire. So that will be things such as literature, slow living, poetry, the arts. But mostly I just really want you to leave here having a feeling of peace, solace, joy. I don't have a lot of followers. I'm a very new YouTuber, I guess. I deal with some chronic illness, so it's really hard for me to be as consistent as I'd like to be, but I am trying. I think what keeps me putting things out there is the fact that I really believe in the one. I really believe in touching the one and bringing joy to the one, because I know that's how I've been blessed in my life. So hopefully this video means something to you. It gives you something to think about, or at least it makes you feel seen. Anyways, let's get into it. Poetry today is highly divisive. Poets like Rupi Kaur are coming or have come into the scene and have caused quite a ruckus, and that's brought to our attention the need to consider the question, what is poetry? I am no poetry expert, that's my disclaimer, but here are my 2 cents. Before we start talking about Rupi Kaur and what's going on with poetry today, I thought it was rather important for us to talk a little bit about the different time periods of poetry. We can think all the way back to the Greeks. We can think of works such as Odysseus, which is poetic narrative, or like a really long poem. I don't know, I should have done more research on that. We can look back to Old English poetry, Middle English poetry, Renaissance, Romantic, Victorian, etc. Right? Poetry has been consistently a form of art, of a literary art throughout the ages. But also, if we look all the way back, we can see how poetry has changed its shape throughout the centuries. And so something that I've been thinking a lot about is that we have to keep an open mind, because ultimately there is always going to be this push and pull between what is and what will or might be. That's just the way societies and cultures evolve, and I think it can be quite disheartening because we're used to certain things and we have a sense of nostalgia, but that's just kind of like how things evolve. And so I think a lot of us, myself included, hang on to poetry as we've conceived for a very long time, and we have this kind of repulsion towards this new genre that's coming up, such as insta poetry. I personally believe it should not be called poetry, it should be a whole other thing, but I'll get to that later on. I got my notes here. I took notes. I really wanted to differentiate between modern poetry and contemporary poetry. And again, I am by no means an expert on the topic. I just did a little research in preparation for this video. But some of the things I learned are as follows. So modern poetry came to emergence in the late 19th century. It died in the mid 20th century, which is when we got contemporary poetry. So what we have today, when we think about poets like Rupi Kaur or Haley Grace or this quote-unquote insta poets, we're not talking about modern poetry. What we have today is contemporary poetry, or at least part of contemporary poetry. Poets like T.S. Eliot will be modern poet, whereas poets like Maya Angelou and Rupi Kaur will be considered contemporary poets. I just look that way and my kid is stamping me. He's really cute. I am currently printed some poems that I wanted to study and just dive into this month, and some of them are from Domingo Rivero. He's a poet from my home island, Gran Canaria, and his poems are, I think he will be what we will consider a modern poet. Now, something to note about modern poetry is that it is at this point during the mid 19th century that we started apart from the aspects that have typically made poetry poetry. That's saying we are breaking away from traditional forms and conventions. We're breaking away from traditional forms and conventions. And that was something that I noticed with the poet that I've been doing some reading from. Rivero does definitely use a number of poetic devices to really pull out feelings from things that are everyday occurrences. However, there is also a breakaway from the strict rhythm, from strict adherence to poetic rules and conventions. So that was something that I noticed. I think something else that kind of comes into this conversation of, okay, well then, what is poetry and what isn't? I think I've seen the case made that Rupi Kaur, for example, her work isn't really poetry because a lot of the time we are lacking poetic devices. And I mean, I agree with that to an extent, but also there is what I will consider more traditional poetry that doesn't really use conventional devices. I mean, there is such thing as free verse or prose poetry. So I think that's something to consider. I think one of the reasons why poetry is so divisive is because as a society we rely on shared meaning, and current poetry works don't adhere to that shared meaning of what poetry actually is and entails. And I think that's what makes it so hard to consider Rupi Kaur, Haley Gray's poets. I know I said that poetry is dead on the title, but poetry is not dead. Those who love and cherish poetry will continue consuming poetry. I think, however, that there's this birth of a whole new different literary genre that I wouldn't personally even consider a genre within poetry. I think it's its own thing. And actually someone in my TikTok suggested neo-poetry, and I really liked it. I think this insta poetry is far enough from poetry, but they originate within poetry. And so I do believe that neo-poetry is a more apt term to refer to the work of these poets. Well, it is also true that no one owns poetry, right? Like, no one can say this is poetry and this isn't poetry, and poetry is subjective. I mean, sure, those things are true, but by that same token, I mean, we rely on shared meaning. So I could also say this video is poetry. So whilst it is true that no one has quote unquote a monopoly on poetry, we still have to engage with these new works that are coming up in critical ways and actually decide, what is it? I do want to say that whilst I do not consider it poetry, I still think it is beautiful. These are all of my poetry collections. I studied this one and really thoroughly enjoyed it. It's an anthology of Black and Creole poetry. This would be considered contemporary poetry. I believe it is mostly contemporary poetry. And it came from a variety of different authors, so you could see different styles. But again, this was very clearly poetry. I found that there were some poems that were straightforward, but there were other poems that you had to engage with a bit more and think about critically to really harvest their meaning. For me, that's one of the most fun aspects of poetry, is the fact that depending on who's reading it and when they're reading it, it can mean different things. I like writing poetry, whether it's good poetry or not. I like writing it, and I find that it's a way for me to get out my thoughts in a way that I don't feel too exposed. I believe that one of the beauty of poetry is how enigmatic it can be. However, poetry doesn't always have to be enigmatic and mysterious. I think it can also be straightforward, and it is still poetry. I bought this little collection from a farmer's market from a local poet. I honestly haven't gotten a chance to read this yet. I do think it's pretty straightforward, very accessible, more in the vein of Rupi Kaur, Haley Gray's, deals with things that it looks like as a society, or at least this younger generation, is very interested in, such as trauma, healing, and so forth. So I haven't yet had a chance to study this, but I look forward to doing it. Now, these are the two collections that I really wanted to get to. This first one is The Sun and Her Flowers by Rupi Kaur. I bought this because it was super popular, and I started it, I opened it, and I was like, what is this? I did not I did not like it. I did not finish it. I did not engage with it in any way, shape, or form. But I think it's because I was expecting poetry, what I was used to, the meaning that I attached to poetry. Years later, I got this gift from my brother's fiance. It's a collection by Haley Grace. She's super popular on TikTok and Instagram. I didn't know who she was, but I read this, and by this point I already knew. I was like, okay, this is not gonna be like my, like my more classic poetry compilation. This dealt with colonialism, colonial trauma, race, things that are heavy, which frankly, to be honest, Save Me in Orange also deals with heavy things, but the way those things are explored here require you to sit down and think thoroughly about what's being said and how it is being said. And there's so much merit to it. There's so much merit and beauty to the way poetic devices are used to convey a feeling of oppressiveness, a feeling of shame or fear. With Save Me in Orange, everything was pretty straightforward. I started it, and frankly, I just read like a stream of consciousness diary entries. And because I wasn't expecting this more elaborate work, I was able to enjoy it for what it was. I didn't enjoy it as a work of poetry, but I enjoyed it as what I hope one day will be considered perhaps neo-poetry. This collection dealt with some really heavy topics. It dealt with familial trauma, generational trauma, abuse, and hope and healing. And I feel like the advantage of works such as Haley Grace's and Ruby Kaur's is that they're very accessible. They're very easy to be digested. They don't require you to be thinking deep and hard. Even though there is poetry, what I will call more traditional poetry, that doesn't require you to be puzzling things together, this is just a completely different reading experience. And I think especially younger people, I'm talking about young women entering their teenage years, going through difficult teenage years, could really benefit from reading something like this. Something else to consider is that because the nature of this work, of the writing, of the prose and the style and structure is so disjointed and nonsensical, it doesn't really follow a format. It also could be said in and of itself that it is a artistic choice. So those are my thoughts. I don't think that this is bad work as something other than poetry. As poetry, frankly, I don't really think it has much merit. And I feel like that's something else that makes this whole thing very divisive. For example, Ruby Kaur, and to be fair, I will eventually get to this now that I know what to expect. But I think something that's been hard for a lot of people is that someone is getting so much recognition from work that's to some extent mediocre. You don't really get a whole lot of nuance. These collections didn't feel like something that someone had to really think and plan for. It's quite disrespectful, in my opinion, to consider this poetry, because I feel like it takes away from the work that other poets put into their craft. But that's just my opinion. I will love and I welcome thoughts from those who agree with me and those who disagree. And please tell me why you disagree. I'm really open to be convinced and to be swayed. I just feel like that can be unfair and discouraging to people who engage in the more challenging aspect of poetry, in my opinion. That is not to say that it's not enjoyable, and that is not to say that people can feel comfort from reading these. That's not my point at all. I just don't feel like it is appropriate to call poetry. I had a really good time reading this collection. I folded so many pages. There were so many things here that I thought were enjoyable. I hope that this video was at the very least entertaining. As I said earlier, I am no poetry expert, but I am willing to learn. I am looking forward to learning. I really enjoy it. it's something that I'm trying to get more into. So if you have any recommendations, I don't really care about genre, just let me know what your favorite poem is and I'd love to check it out. I hope that you enjoyed this video. As I said earlier, I just struggle quite a bit with my health, but I'm really trying to be more regular here. So it will mean a lot if you could subscribe. It would just make me feel very supported, but also no pressure. You can do whatever you want. I'll see you next time. Miss you, love you.